In a frozen alley, a young girl was cornered, mocked, and forced to apologize for nothing she did wrong. The men blocking her way believed fear would keep them invisible. They were wrong. A retired Navy SEAL stopped walking. Beside him, a German shepherd remembered what it meant to protect. This is not a story about violence, but about how God turns quiet courage into miracles. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Minneapolis lay under winter's grip. Alleys iced over, breath turning to fog, the city humming low beneath snow-muted sirens. A narrow back street waited unseen, where a quiet life and a brutal habit were about to collide. Michael Hayes had learned to measure silence the way other men measured time, not by seconds, but by weight. The taxi's engine idled behind him, a tired purr against the cold, while the alley ahead held a different soundlessness, tight, expectant, the kind that pressed against the ribs. At 45, retirement from the teams had not softened him. It had only rearranged the noise. The explosions were gone. The orders were gone. What remained was the space where decisions used to land, and the old reflex to scan corners before the mind could intervene. Shadow stood at Michael's side, leash loose, posture alert without strain. The dog felt the alley before Michael stepped into it, felt the wrongness, the imbalance of voices pitched too high and laughter pitched too sharp. Shadow's instincts didn't name things, they weighed them. And this place was heavy. Michael told himself he was just passing through. He had said it 1,000 times since leaving service. Passing through the day, passing through the city, passing through a life that was supposed to be quieter now. He drove nights because nights asked fewer questions. He kept his world small because small worlds were easier to protect. A voice cut through the cold, not loud, not frantic, mocking. Michael paused. That pause, the fraction of a heartbeat between motion and restraint, was a habit drilled into him long ago. He breathed in, the air burned. Emily Parker stood pressed to brick, 18 and trying very hard to look older than fear. Michael didn't know her name yet. He saw the shape of the moment before he saw the person, a young woman boxed in by bodies that took up space on purpose. Duke Ransom was easy to spot, even without the tattoos and shaved head. There was a confidence to him that came from repetition, from the knowledge that no one usually stopped him. Predators did not need rage. They needed routine. Michael's first instinct was the old one: move fast, end it, leave no doubt. It rose in him like a remembered tide. He felt the tension coil, felt Shadow's muscles answer in kind, ready to act as one. But another instinct followed, quieter, earned later. This wasn't a battlefield. There were witnesses, cameras, laws that did not speak the language of adrenaline. Michael had learned, painfully, that winning the moment could lose the war. He stepped forward anyway, not into the center, just enough to be seen. Shadow mirrored him, gaze steady, presence unmistakable. The dog did not bare teeth. He did not growl. He simply existed with purpose, and that was often enough. Duke laughed. It was a sound Michael recognized from faraway places, the laugh of someone certain the world would bend. Duke's eyes flicked to Shadow, then back to Michael, assessing. The laugh wavered. Predators hated variables. Michael felt the pull of memory, faces of men he couldn't save, rooms where apologies came too late. Retirement had not erased those rooms. It had just removed the uniforms that explained them. He wondered, briefly and bitterly, if he was allowed to intervene now that he no longer wore the flag on his shoulder. He wondered who he was without permission. Emily's hands shook as she reached for something Duke had dropped at her feet. The humiliation was deliberate. Michael felt it land in his chest like a weight he hadn't chosen, but refused to ignore. He remembered another young voice once, cracking over a radio, asking for help that came a minute too late. He had promised himself he would not be late again if he could help it. "Step back," Michael said. The words were calm, almost gentle. He hated how much effort that took. Duke took a step closer instead, not enough to touch, enough to threaten. Shadow shifted, placing himself squarely between Michael and Duke, a living line drawn in the snow. The dog's loyalty wasn't loud, it was complete. Shadow trusted Michael's restraint, even as he prepared for the absence of it. Michael felt the leash in his hand and the years in his bones. He could feel the easy road and the right one diverging like frozen tracks. He chose the harder path. He always did, eventually. Emily looked at him then, not pleading, assessing. She had learned, too young, to measure men quickly. Michael held her gaze just long enough to say what words might cheapen, "You are not alone." He gestured for her to move behind him, and when she did, something inside him steadied. Protecting someone was simpler than protecting oneself. The alley drew a small crowd, windows opening, phones lifting. Duke's smile tightened. The routine was breaking. He spat a threat that hung in the air, ugly and recordable, and Michael felt the moment lock into place. Evidence, not fists. Proof. Shadow felt the shift as clearly as Michael did. The dog's tension eased by a hair, replaced by vigilance. This was not the time to strike. This was the time to stand. Sirens sounded somewhere distant, a reminder of systems that worked slowly, imperfectly. Michael knew those systems. He had worked around them, beneath them, in spite of them. Tonight, he would work with them, not because he trusted them blindly, but because he understood what it took to force them to look. When Duke finally backed away, it was with a promise disguised as laughter. Michael did not answer it. He watched until the danger retreated, then watched some more. He had learned that leaving too early invited return. Emily exhaled. It sounded like a door opening. They stood there for a moment longer, the three of them, man, dog, girl, framed by brick and winter. Michael felt the familiar ache settle in his chest, the one that came whenever he stepped into someone else's fight. He knew this was not over. He knew tonight would echo. But he also knew something else, something steadier than doubt. Some battles didn't end with victory. They began with presence. Shadow leaned lightly against his leg as if to say the same. Michael nodded once, to no one in particular, and prepared himself for what came next. Night settled deeper over Minneapolis, snow crusting the sidewalks and sealing sound into a dull hush as the alley emptied, leaving cold air, distant sirens, and the uneasy aftertaste of something interrupted, but unfinished. Michael Hayes walked away from the alley with Emily Parker a half step behind, the city stretching around them like a test he had not studied for, but somehow recognized. The moment had passed, yet his body refused to release it, muscles holding tension, as if Duke Ransom might reappear from any shadow, as if restraint itself required vigilance. Retirement had taught Michael Hayes that the absence of combat did not mean the absence of responsibility. It only removed the clear lines. He felt that familiar, uncomfortable pull inside his chest, the one that arrived whenever he chose not to act the way he once had, whenever he let a threat walk away still breathing, still capable of returning. Shadow stayed close, instincts tuned to Michael Hayes rather than the street, carrying the quiet memory of other nights when waiting had meant survival. Emily Parker spoke only when necessary, voice low, clipped, as if words themselves might provoke pursuit. Michael Hayes noticed how she watched intersections, how she flinched at sudden sounds, and the recognition landed hard. Fear learned through repetition was not dramatic, it was efficient. He wanted to say something reassuring, but reassurance offered too early often rang hollow, so he settled for presence, the same thing he had learned to offer teammates when words failed. As they reached the sidewalk, Emily Parker stopped, fingers tightening around her bag, and asked in a voice stripped of pretense whether Duke Ransom would come back. Michael Hayes did not lie. He told her that men like that relied on silence and predictability, and that both had just been disrupted. He said it mattered that there were witnesses, that there was a record now, even if incomplete. He did not say that disruption also invited escalation, because that truth would arrive soon enough. Shadow shifted at his side, sensing the tension spike. Recalling other moments when humans debated futures, the dog could already smell approaching. Michael Hayes offered Emily Parker a ride, not as a savior, but as a temporary solution, and she hesitated only a second before nodding, the calculation visible and adult in a way that unsettled him more than panic would have. In the cab, the heater rattled and the windshield wipers scraped ice in a steady rhythm that pulled Michael Hayes inward, back toward a memory of another cold vehicle years ago, another night when he had watched a younger teammate bleed out while the radio crackled with maybes and delays. That night had taught him the cost of waiting on systems to notice urgency. He felt the old anger stir, then flatten into resolve. He asked Emily Parker a few careful questions, not prying, just enough to understand the pattern, and she answered with the blunt efficiency of someone tired of explaining herself to people who doubted first and listened later. Duke Ransom, she said, liked to make people apologize, liked to turn fear into performance, and liked the alley because it existed between places where responsibility blurred. Michael Hayes listened, cataloging details the way he once cataloged terrain, not to plan violence, but to plan leverage. Shadow remained still, absorbing the emotional charge, loyalty expressed not through action, but through readiness, the dog's own past shaping a preference for watchfulness over impulse. When they reached Emily Parker's neighborhood, she hesitated again, then asked why Michael Hayes had stopped. The question was simple and heavy. He considered offering the polished answer about doing the right thing. But instead, he told the truth as he understood it now, because he had learned what happened when nobody did. The words surprised him with their steadiness. Emily Parker nodded, not in gratitude, but in recognition, as if she understood that kind of answer better than comfort. After she stepped out and disappeared into the building, Michael Hayes stayed parked for a moment longer, staring at the snow collecting on the hood, feeling the quiet return. He knew the encounter had shifted something, not just for Emily Parker, but for himself. He had crossed an invisible line from observer to participant, and the city would not let him uncross it easily. As he drove away, Shadow's attention sharpened, picking up on the subtle signals Michael Hayes gave off when his mind began assembling contingencies. There would be calls to make, cameras to check, routines to disrupt, all within boundaries he had not always respected in his former life. The thought both steadied and unsettled him. Far behind them the alley waited, indifferent and patient, and Michael Hayes understood that Duke Ransom would not forget being denied an ending. That understanding settled like ice in his gut, not fear exactly, but certainty, and with it came the knowledge that the next encounter would demand more than presence. Morning broke cold and colorless over Minneapolis, snow hardening into gray crusts along the curbs as the city resumed its routines, unaware that a quiet line had already been crossed and would not easily be erased. Michael Hayes woke before the alarm, the way he always did when his mind refused to release a problem. The apartment was still, heat ticking softly in the walls, the kind of stillness that once meant safety, but now only meant time to think. He lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the alley not as it happened, but as it could have gone wrong, could still go wrong, every variation branching like a map of frozen roads. Retirement had taken away mission briefings and after-action reports, but it had not taken away the habit of preparation, and that habit now turned inward, relentless. Shadow rose when Michael Hayes did, not startled, simply attentive, sensing the shift from rest to intent. The dog carried his own memories, shaped by training, and moments when hesitation had cost pain, and those memories pressed him toward readiness without noise. Michael Hayes brewed coffee he barely tasted and stood at the window, watching pedestrians move with heads down, collars up, everyone negotiating winter alone. He wondered how many of them carried private alleys inside, places they avoided by instinct. The thought of Emily Parker surfaced again, not as an image, but as a weight, the weight of having seen him step in and now perhaps expecting him to continue. Responsibility, Michael Hayes knew, was not a switch you could flip off once someone else had seen it turned on. He considered walking away entirely, telling himself he had done enough. That intervention once did not obligate him forever. The argument was neat and tempting, and he did not trust it. Shadow watched him pace, feeling the unresolved tension, offering the quiet pressure of presence by following a step behind, reminding Michael Hayes that some bonds formed quickly because they echoed older ones. Michael Hayes pulled on his jacket and went out into the cold, deciding not on a grand plan, but on the next right step, a philosophy he had learned late and paid for early. The neighborhood Emily Parker had named was not far, a strip of small businesses opening reluctantly, lights flickering on as if against their will. Michael Hayes walked it slowly, not searching for Duke Ransom directly, but for patterns, for the places where people lingered because they felt unseen. He noted a corner store with an aging camera pointed outward, a bar that kept its door half closed even in daylight, a gap in coverage where the alley curved just enough to disappear. None of this required heroics, only attention, and attention was something he still had in abundance. Shadow's focus sharpened at the mouth of the alley, body language shifting, as if the air itself carried residue, and Michael Hayes felt the same tightening he had felt before entering hostile streets overseas, the awareness that space remembered what happened in it. He did not go in, not yet. He stood at the edge and listened, absorbing the normal sounds layered over something quieter, a sense of entitlement lingering like exhaust. As he turned away, a man from the corner store glanced at him, curiosity mixed with caution, and Michael Hayes gave a nod that asked nothing but acknowledged everything. The man did not speak, but his eyes followed Shadow a moment longer than necessary, recognition flickering. On the walk back, Michael Hayes's phone buzzed, a number he did not know, and he felt a brief flash of irritation before answering, the old discipline overriding the urge to ignore. The voice on the other end was Emily Parker's, steadier than the night before, but still carrying strain, telling him Duke Ransom had driven past her building twice already, slow, deliberate. Michael Hayes closed his eyes, feeling the internal argument collapse into clarity. This was the escalation he had anticipated, not dramatic enough to alarm strangers, precise enough to unsettle the target. He told Emily Parker to stay inside, to document times and details, to trust that being watched did not mean being powerless, even if it felt that way. He hated that advice, hated how familiar it sounded, but he also knew it was necessary. When the call ended, Michael Hayes stood for a long moment, phone in hand, letting the weight settle fully this time. He thought of the systems that moved too slowly and the men who exploited that slowness, and he felt the old frustration rise, tempered now by a different resolve. He would not confront Duke Ransom again yet. He would not give him the spectacle he craved. Instead, Michael Hayes would do what he had learned to do when brute force failed to hold. He would make the environment hostile to abuse. Shadow sensed the decision before Michael Hayes articulated it, tension easing into purpose, the dog's loyalty aligning with a path that required patience rather than teeth. As they headed back toward the alley from a different angle, Michael Hayes noticed how his fear had changed shape. It was no longer fear of violence, but fear of complacency, of allowing the interruption of last night to stand alone and therefore mean nothing. That fear, he knew, was useful. It kept him honest. Near the end of the block, he saw a police cruiser roll past without slowing, routine and detached, and the sight stirred a memory of waiting for backup that never came on time. He did not resent it anymore. Resentment wasted energy. What he felt instead was resolve sharpened by limits. He would gather what he needed, stay within the lines, and force attention where it had been absent. As he paused at the corner, snow beginning to fall again in thin, indifferent flakes, Michael Hayes understood that Duke Ransom was testing boundaries not only with Emily Parker, but with the city itself, and that tests invited responses. Shadow lifted his head, alert to movement down the street, a familiar shape slowing near the alley entrance, and Michael Hayes felt certainty lock into place. This was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would be allowed to happen next. Late afternoon pressed a pale winter sun against Minneapolis, snow falling thinner now, the alley half lit and half forgotten, its silence stretched tight, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Michael Hayes returned to the area with intention rather than urgency, the difference subtle but decisive, the kind learned after years of mistaking speed for control. He had not slept much, not because of fear, but because the mind refused to leave a problem unfinished once it had claimed ownership of it. Retirement had taken away uniforms and authority, but it had not taken away the responsibility he felt when patterns repeated and harm became predictable. Shadow walked beside him with the same measured focus, carrying memories of earlier days when standing still had been a form of courage, when waiting for the right moment mattered more than proving readiness. Michael Hayes kept his movements ordinary on purpose, blending into the flow of people who wanted nothing more than to get home before dark, because spectacle fed men like Duke Ransom and anonymity starved them. He paused near the corner store again, pretending to check his phone, letting the small camera at his chest settle into place, its presence legal, quiet, patient. The alley lay ahead, unchanged in shape but altered in meaning, a place no longer invisible to him. He felt the internal debate flicker once more, the question of whether he was escalating simply by showing up again, but he pushed it aside with a hard-earned understanding. Avoidance did not equal de-escalation when the threat was habitual. Shadow sensed the shift and adjusted, loyalty translating into steadiness, into a refusal to be distracted by passing noise or sudden motion. Michael Hayes scanned reflections rather than faces, a habit from long ago, and caught the approach before it announced itself. Duke Ransom emerged as if summoned by expectation alone, confidence intact but sharpened, the smile thinner than before. The moment stretched, not with violence but with recognition, each man measuring the other's intent. Michael Hayes felt the old instinct to close distance rise and fall again, replaced by something colder and more deliberate. He did not speak first. He let Duke Ransom fill the silence, knowing that men accustomed to dominance often betrayed themselves when denied reaction. Duke Ransom obliged, voice low and mocking, accusing Michael Hayes of following him, of playing hero, of interfering where he did not belong. The words were familiar in shape, if not in sound, echoing other confrontations in other places where authority had been challenged by restraint rather than force. Michael Hayes answered evenly, naming the behavior without dramatizing it, stating clearly that harassment had been observed, recorded, and would no longer pass unnoticed. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He felt Shadow tense slightly at his side, not to attack, but to anchor, the dog's awareness spanning past and present, remembering that moments like this often tipped unexpectedly. Duke Ransom laughed again, louder this time, performing for an audience that did not exist, then stepped closer, testing boundaries the way he always did, hoping to provoke a mistake. Michael Hayes held his ground, heart rate steady, the discipline ingrained so deeply it felt almost impersonal. He thought briefly of Emily Parker, of how fear learned through repetition carved grooves in the nervous system, and that thought hardened his resolve without feeding his anger. A passerby slowed at the sidewalk, curiosity pricked, and Michael Hayes noticed Duke Ransom's attention flicker, the mask slipping just enough to reveal calculation. This was the edge Michael Hayes needed, the thin place where routine broke down. He stated again calmly that the interaction was being documented and that further contact would be reported. The words themselves were simple, but the act of saying them without fear shifted the balance, transforming the alley from a private stage into a public record. Shadow felt the release before Michael Hayes did, tension easing as Duke Ransom stepped back, the predator recognizing a change in terrain. The retreat was not gracious, but it was real, punctuated by a promise that tried and failed to sound like certainty. Michael Hayes did not respond. He waited until Duke Ransom was gone from sight, and then waited longer, letting the adrenaline drain fully, rather than carrying it into the next decision. As the alley emptied again, Michael Hayes felt neither triumph nor relief, only a clear-eyed awareness that this was a beginning disguised as an ending. He checked the recording, confirmed the capture, and allowed himself a single, measured breath. Shadow leaned in slightly, not for reassurance, but for confirmation that the course had been set, and Michael Hayes rested a hand briefly at his side, the gesture automatic and grounding. As they turned away, Michael Hayes noticed the corner store owner watching from behind the glass, uncertainty softening into something like consideration. It struck him then that the most difficult part of this would not be confronting Duke Ransom again, but convincing others that intervention did not require heroics, only consistency. He thought of the systems that moved when pressured and stalled when ignored, and he understood that pressure had to be applied carefully, repeatedly, without spectacle. The snow began to fall a little harder, erasing footprints almost as soon as they appeared, and Michael Hayes felt the familiar frustration of knowing that evidence could disappear as easily as tracks, if not preserved. He resolved to act before that happened, to take what he had gathered and place it where it could no longer be dismissed. As he reached the end of the block, his phone vibrated again, and the name on the screen made him pause just long enough to feel the weight of what came next. Whatever Emily Parker was about to say, Michael Hayes knew the pattern was tightening, and that the next step would require him to engage the system he trusted least, but needed most. Gray daylight hovered over Minneapolis as snow softened into slush, the city moving with bureaucratic patience, while one small story prepared to collide with a system that preferred numbers to names and order to discomfort. Michael Hayes sat in the parked car outside the precinct longer than necessary, hands resting loosely on the wheel, feeling the familiar resistance rise in his chest, not fear of confrontation, but mistrust earned slowly over years of watching responsibility dissolve into procedure. He had learned long ago that institutions spoke a different language than urgency, a language of forms, thresholds, and acceptable delays, and stepping back into that world stirred memories he usually kept buried under routine. Shadow waited beside him, calm but attentive, sensing that this place carried a different kind of danger, one without sharp edges, yet capable of grinding people down all the same. Michael Hayes thought of Emily Parker, of the way her voice had tightened when she described being watched, followed just enough to unsettle, but never enough to trigger alarms, and he understood that this was exactly the kind of behavior systems struggled to name. He reminded himself that preparation mattered, that walking in with emotion alone would only confirm the doubts he expected to face. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee, a neutral scent that promised nothing and demanded patience. A desk officer glanced up, expression already halfway to dismissal, and Michael Hayes felt the instinct to square his shoulders, to assert himself the way rank once allowed, but he resisted it, choosing instead the slower path of clarity. He explained why he was there, what he had witnessed, what he had recorded, keeping his voice level and his account precise, offering facts without embellishment. The officer listened with the careful detachment of someone trained to filter stories for exaggeration, and Michael Hayes recognized the look, having worn it himself in other contexts, the look that asked whether this would be worth the paperwork. Shadow lay quietly at his feet, presence steady, absorbing the emotional charge without reacting, loyalty expressed through patience rather than demand. When Michael Hayes presented the footage, the shift was subtle but unmistakable, skepticism giving way to attention, the kind that followed evidence rather than sentiment. Another officer joined, then a supervisor, questions sharpening, timelines aligning, and Michael Hayes felt the slow machinery begin to turn, not because of who he was, but because of what he had brought. Still, the frustration lingered. The awareness that even now the behavior might be classified as minor, the kind of thing that fell between categories unless repeated loudly enough. Michael Hayes pushed back gently, naming patterns rather than incidents, explaining how intimidation thrived on predictability and silence, how escalation often hid behind technicalities. He did not accuse the system. He described its blind spots, and in doing so felt a strange echo of past briefings where success depended on persuading decision-makers to see terrain as it truly was, not as it appeared on a map. A female officer, quieter than the others, asked about Emily Parker directly, about her age, her routine, her fear, and Michael Hayes sensed an opening, the human element slipping back into a process designed to minimize it. He answered carefully, aware that speaking for Emily Parker carried its own responsibility, one he did not take lightly. Shadow shifted slightly as voices rose and fell, the dog's instincts alert to stress rather than threat, recalling moments when confined spaces amplified tension. After what felt like hours compressed into minutes, Michael Hayes was told a report would be opened, that increased patrols would be considered, that further contact should be documented immediately. It was not a promise of resolution, but it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement mattered more than reassurance. As he left the building, cold air biting harder than before, Michael Hayes felt the weight of expectation settle fully now, the understanding that once a system was engaged, withdrawal became its own kind of statement. His phone vibrated almost immediately, Emily Parker's name lighting the screen, and the timing tightened his jaw. She told him Duke Ransom had been seen again near the alley, not approaching, just watching, and Michael Hayes felt the familiar surge of anger flare and flatten, anger no longer seeking release but direction. He told her what had been set in motion, not to comfort her, but to anchor her in reality, to remind her that attention had shifted even if outcomes had not yet arrived. Shadow pressed closer as Michael Hayes listened, sensing the strain, loyalty adjusting to a role that required endurance rather than action. When the call ended, Michael Hayes stood for a moment in the falling snow, the city moving past him, unaware of the small but significant pressure building beneath its surface. He knew Duke Ransom would test the response, would probe for weakness the way men like him always did, and he knew that the next phase would demand not just documentation, but resolve from people unused to being watched themselves. As he turned toward the car, Michael Hayes realized the real confrontation ahead was not with Duke Ransom alone, but with the collective hesitation that allowed men like him to operate for so long. The thought settled heavily, but it did not deter him. It clarified him. Somewhere behind the ordinary noise of the city, a boundary had been drawn, and Michael Hayes understood that the system had now been invited to step across it, whether it was ready or not. Winter loosened its grip on Minneapolis just enough to turn snow to slush, the city breathing in muted gray tones as streets reflected cold light and the long tension of recent days prepared, quietly, to resolve. Michael Hayes stood near the mouth of the alley as patrol lights washed the brick walls in intermittent color. The scene ordinary enough that most passers-by barely slowed, and that ordinariness mattered because it meant the moment had shifted from spectacle to process. He felt the familiar dual awareness settle in, one part of him tracking movement and angles out of habit, another part deliberately letting go, trusting that control no longer depended on his hands alone. Shadow remained close, alert, but calm, sensing that this was not a night for confrontation, but for endurance, the kind of endurance learned through long hours of waiting when action would only complicate what patience could resolve. Duke Ransom arrived as expected, confidence worn thinner now, behavior adjusted just enough to skirt obvious violation, and Michael Hayes observed without approaching, the distance intentional, the boundary clear. When the officers stepped in, their presence steady rather than aggressive, Michael Hayes felt a release he had not anticipated, not relief exactly, but confirmation that the burden had begun to redistribute. The exchange was brief and procedural, identification checked, warnings formalized, patterns acknowledged aloud in a way that stripped them of their invisibility, and Duke Ransom's protest rang hollow against the quiet certainty of documentation. Michael Hayes did not speak during it, resisting the urge to narrate or justify, understanding that his role at this point was to let the system speak its own language back to itself. Shadow sensed the shift as well, tension easing into a watchful stillness, loyalty no longer braced for immediate defense, but anchored in presence. Emily Parker arrived a few minutes later with a community advocate who had reached out after the report was filed, the advocate's role simple and practical, a reminder that support did not always arrive in uniform. Emily Parker stood a little straighter than before, fear still present, but no longer dictating every movement, and when she looked at Michael Hayes, there was no gratitude that demanded repayment, only recognition of shared effort. The officers explained next steps clearly, what constituted violation, what would trigger escalation, what protections were now formally in place, and as they spoke, Michael Hayes watched Emily Parker's face, noting the moment when abstraction turned into something solid enough to hold. He remembered other briefings, other lists of contingencies, and felt a quiet satisfaction that this time the information empowered rather than overwhelmed. When the patrol cars moved on and the alley returned to its subdued quiet, Michael Hayes felt the weight he had been carrying finally shift, not vanish, but settle into something manageable. He spoke briefly with the advocate, exchanging contact information, making sure Emily Parker had more than one point of support, because reliance on a single protector was just another form of vulnerability. Shadow observed the exchange, instincts attuned to emotional currents rather than threat, carrying the imprint of a past where humans had learned too late that isolation magnified harm. As they began to disperse, Michael Hayes felt the familiar tug of responsibility one last time, the question of whether he should stay involved longer, monitor more closely, remain on guard, and he answered it not with impulse but with trust. Trust in the structures now engaged, and trust in Emily Parker's growing agency. He walked her partway home, not as an escort, but as a neighbor sharing space, and along the way they spoke of ordinary things, weather, work, small plans that had nothing to do with alleys or fear, and Michael Hayes felt how powerful that ordinariness could be when reclaimed. At her building, Emily Parker paused and said quietly that she had thought strength meant not needing help, and that now she understood it could also mean knowing when to accept it. And Michael Hayes nodded, thinking of how long it had taken him to learn the same lesson. As she went inside, Shadow watched until the door closed, then turned back to Michael Hayes with the calm expectation that comes when a task is complete. The walk home felt lighter, though the city had not changed, and Michael Hayes noticed how his own reflection in darkened windows looked less like a man waiting for the next problem and more like someone re-entering a life interrupted. He made a simple dinner, fed Shadow, and sat by the window as night settled, listening to distant traffic and the ordinary sounds of people living unremarkable evenings, and he felt contentment, not as an emotion, but as an absence of vigilance. He thought of the alley, now just another piece of the city rather than a private stage for cruelty, and understood that resolution rarely arrived with certainty or applause, but with systems doing their unglamorous work, and individuals choosing not to look away. When Michael Hayes finally turned off the light, Shadow settling nearby, he felt the last trace of the old restlessness ease, replaced by a quieter purpose, the knowledge that some battles ended not when an enemy was defeated, but when harm lost its audience and fear lost its isolation. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a stranger who chooses not to look away, through courage that shows up before certainty, or through a heart that refuses to stay silent when something is wrong. God does not always change the world by making noise. Often, He changes it by placing the right people in the right moment, asking them to stand, to listen, and to protect. In our everyday lives, most of us will never face an alley like this one, but we all face moments when fear tries to isolate us, when doing the right thing feels lonely, or when silence seems easier than truth. Those moments are invitations to trust God, to act with compassion, and to become a small miracle for someone else. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or a moment when faith helped you stand strong. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who feel unseen. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you strength in the quiet battles of daily life. And may He use your kindness, your voice, and your faith to bring light where it is needed most.